war to separate ourselves from Old England. It would have been better if Benjamin Kingsbury were here to talk about Joseph, since Mr. Kingsbury became acquainted with the Robichaux family while he was one of the select men of Walpole and an overseer of the poor for that town. Since he is unable to be here tonight, Marie and I will speak in his stead. However, his letters and papers, among other sources, have come down to me, and I have gotten to know some of the facts about Joseph, his family, and the events surrounding his life. It may be of interest to you citizens of Bellingham that the Emerald family arrived in Bellingham shortly after the Robichauxs under similar circumstances. My wife Marie is more romantic and more creative than I am. By inference and intuition, she will offer credible suppositions and insights where I will mainly endeavor to provide the facts as I found them. Joseph's life on this earth ended on or about December 10th, in the 10th year of our independence, during that harsh winter of '86. The day he died isn't clear because he was shipwrecked in Boston Harbor and found cast off on Lovell's Island, where he likely froze to death. He was only 31 years old and the father of 3 children. In any case, the facts of his death aren't as interesting as the facts of his life. To understand the lives of the Robichauxs and the Emeralds, their story must be set against the larger stage of world affairs. These families, who would eventually find their way to Bellingham and Wrentham, started out life as French-speaking colonists in Acadia, now known to us as Nova Scotia. I say French-speaking because they were neutral and were not loyal to the French or the English. These people were clustered along western Acadia from Port Royal to the Minas Basin and considered themselves Acadians. To us, they are known as French neutrals. The Emeralds were from Cape Sable, and Joseph Robichaux. Joseph Robichaux's family was from Port Royal. From the first French settlement at Port Royal in 1605 until the middle of the century, the number of Acadians were increasing fast. A census of Acadian parishes from 1714 shows a count of 1,259 souls. The greatest concentration of Acadians was in Port Royal with 210 families.
Please consider the parallel of Port Royal being founded in 1605, with our own Plymouth colony having been settled in the year 1620. We hold our original colonists as forefathers, having settled this great country. We often contemplate their toils and struggles and applaud their successes. How difficult it must have been sailing to lands unknown to endure the endless work of providing for themselves off the land and the brutal winters to carry on their dreams and make a better future for the children and grandchildren, for our children. How proud they must have been not only to have survived, but to have thrived for over 150 years.
The expansion of French and English colonies resulted in competition for land in North America. The seeds of misfortune for the French-speaking Catholics living in Acadia were sown in 1713, when the European powers agreed to the Treaty of Utrecht to end the War of Spanish Succession. As a result of the treaty, mainland Acadia was ceded to England in 1713. Port Royal became Annapolis Royal, and the name of the colony was changed to Nova Scotia. Pierre, Marguerite, and the rest of their Acadian neighbors were now British subjects. In spite of the change in ownership, the British did little to interfere with the Acadian way of life. Acadians continued to speak French, practice their Catholic faith, and live among the Micmac. During the early 1700s, these Acadian families prospered. They were seasonal farmers who raised cattle, sheep, and children, many children. Joseph's father, Pierre, and his mother, Marguerite, were both born during this period in 1725 and 1729, respectively. Joseph's older brother, Peter, was also born in Nova Scotia in 1753. By 1755, about 12,000 Acadians lived along the western coast of Nova Scotia, spread from Annapolis Royal to the Minas Basin. Sadly, the fortunes of the French in North America were about to take a turn for the worst. This picture of domestic life in Acadia becomes dwarfed by the arrival of the British. In 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle that ended the War of Austrian Succession set the stage for another war. It was then that this long-neglected colony in Nova Scotia became strategically important to the English. With the French and Indian War looming, the English feared that the French-speaking Catholic population represented a threat. The English pressured the neutral colonists to swear absolute allegiance to the British crown, even to the point of carrying arms against other French-speaking Catholics and the Micmac natives that they had lived among for over 100 years, something most would not do. After 1748, most of these people realized that their lives were never going to be the same. As part of the larger English plan to fortify Nova Scotia, General Edward Cornwallis, uncle of Charles Cornwallis of Yorktown infamy, was sent to Halifax in 1749. By 1750, hundreds of British soldiers were in the area. Trouble seemed inevitable, and the French-speaking population knew that they were going to be caught in the middle of an armed conflict. The native Micmac, sworn allies of the French military, were also making their presence felt. In a letter to acting Governor Phipps of Massachusetts, dated the 3rd of May, 1750, General Cornwallis wrote,
I know that Lacorne and Loutre and the other priests at Chinecto have been doing such mischief in this province as one nation never attempted towards another in profound peace. I know that they set the Micmacs against us. They made the inhabitants of Chinecto swear allegiance to the French king, that Loutre has more than once at Cobequid to stir the other inhabitants to rebellion, that messages, promises, and threats have been constantly sent to His Majesty's subjects, the French inhabitants, all over the province to make them dire, that they are threatened with a general massacre if they remain.
This left the French-speaking neutrals pulled at by two sides. They were now English subjects in an English colony and were therefore expected to take up arms against the French military. Meanwhile, the French military expected them to take up arms against the legitimate English colonial government. Some colonists left and fled for other French-speaking colonies, but the greater number of them continued farming their ancient lands, hoping that they would not be swallowed up in the coming conflict. The worst came in 1755, when their way of life came to an abrupt end.
In October of 1755, the Great Expulsion began. Governor Charles Lawrence of Nova Scotia considered the French neutrals rebels because they would not take the oath of allegiance to the British. The offense of the French neutrals was that they sought to remain neutral in a British colony that was about to be used as a base for war against the French presence in North America.
I suspect that their expulsion had more to do with their farmland than the security of New England.
That may be so, but Lawrence's fear of a revolt was not without merit. In June of 1755, when Fort Baie-Saint-Euro was captured by British and New England forces, Acadians were found among those defending the fort.
They didn't have a choice. The French military forced them to help and even burned their homes.
In any case, the result of Lawrence's distrust was that he removed them from their homeland, a homeland that they had cultivated and raised families in for 150 years. Worst of all, it was decided to disperse them among the English colonies so that these French speakers would not strengthen New France by transporting them there.
If you look closely at this painting, you'll notice that woman praying the rosary. That's significant. This population was Roman Catholic, and they were being torn from their homes and churches. For those being sent to Massachusetts, it meant that it would be impossible for them to practice their religion, since papists were not allowed to practice under penalty of law. The hatred of papists burned so hot in Massachusetts that the Pope was burned in effigy every November 3rd until the year 1775.
Families were torn apart. The men of military age who were most likely to be a threat were gathered up first. Women and children were to be taken when additional ships arrived. I cannot imagine the distress of being separated from everyone who provides me comfort. The officers in charge of the expulsion were instructed in this way. If fair means will not do, then you must proceed with the most vigorous measures possible, not only compelling them to embark, but in depriving any who may escape of all means of shelter or support by burning their houses and destroying everything that may afford them the means of subsistence in the country.
This painting by Claude Picard of Saint Facile captures much of what I imagine when I consider their situation. They were torn from their families and churches in sight of their own burning homes. After this terrible experience began their terrible journey.
Conditions on the ships ranged from bad to abominable. As many as 1/3 of those who departed Nova Scotia perished before ever reaching an English colony. In many cases, the governors of the colonies were reluctant to have this foreign and resentful influx suddenly thrust upon them. A half a dozen ships dropped anchor in Boston Harbor at the beginning of November 1755, bearing a cargo of human misery. Boston was not prepared to receive those who arrived. It was a relatively short journey, but Boston did not have a plan in place to accommodate them, and many of them were forced to stay on the ships in Boston Harbor for months in the winter.
Joseph's brother Pierre was only 2 years old at this time. Can you just imagine trying to care for a child so young while stranded on a vessel in Boston Harbor during the winter?
It is often the case that a story told is not believed because the details seem too strange to our own experience to be believed. It is for this reason that I will share the written statements of those involved so that they may convey their own story. During a meeting of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the following was recorded. Whereas a considerable number of inhabitants of Nova Scotia arrived here the 26th instant, being removed by the governor and council of that province for the security thereof, and no provision being made for their support here, they are in great danger of suffering during this rigorous season without interposition of the court. Ordered that Mr. James Russell, Mr. Cooper, and Mr. Hall, with such as the honorable board may join, be a committee to provide for the support of such inhabitants in Nova Scotia until advice may be had from Governor Lawrence and his orders concerning them, or until an opportunity of applying to His Excellency General Shirley, Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's forces in North America, for his directions concerning them. And the committee to dispose of them in the meantime in such towns within this province as they shall judge least inconvenient to the public. And the selectmen or overseers of the poor of the several towns to which they may be sent, as aforesaid, are hereby authorized and required to receive them, and employ or support them in such a manner as to incur the least charge. And the said inhabitants of Nova Scotia being so received and entertained in any town shall not be construed or understood to be an admission of them as town inhabitants.
And there we are, left with homeless families who no longer have a homeland, stripped of everything they owned in an instant, and forced to rely on the goodwill of those who would be their enemy for their only means of sustenance.
After spending the winter aboard ships and then being spread throughout the Boston area, on October 13th, 1756, the 8 members of the Amirault family were to be split, with 4 of them in Bellingham and 4 in Holliston. The family asked the sheriff who was responsible for transporting them if they could all remain together, so they were all placed in Holliston. Less than 2 years later, in 1758, the selectmen of Holliston petitioned the colony that the Amiraults be sent on to Bellingham or any other town that would take them, since they were not able to support themselves and Holliston was too small to continue providing support for them. Before they finally arrived in Bellingham, they were split into 2 groups, with one in Medway and one in Wrentham. Each of the towns kept records of the goods and services that they provided to the French neutrals. It is through these records that I first became acquainted with the Robichaux and Amirault families. During the Amiraults' time in Medway, the selectmen of that town wrote that the Amiraults were fishermen by trade and were not able to find work in animal husbandry. They also wrote that James Amirault was 59 years old with a lame shoulder and unable to perform much work. James, his wife, and their 3 children finally arrived in Bellingham in January of 1761.
Returning now to the Robichaux family, the first place that we find a record of young Joseph is as an infant in Walpole. The overseers of the poor in Walpole, Benjamin Kingsbury, one of them, reported the details of their life in some detail. Here they wrote, "Whereas the Honorable Court has been pleased to send 11 French neutrals into this town for their care and to be provided for, 4 of which went from this town February 1757 to better land with his wife and 2 children, and the account for the other that remains is as follows from the 1st day of March 1757 till the 1st day of March 1758. We find the Robichaux family enumerated in this list. Pierre Robichaux, aged 31, Marguerite Robichaux, aged 26, Pierre Robichaux, aged 4, and Joseph Robichaux, aged 10 months.
During this period, the land that had been taken from the Acadians was offered to New Englanders who were willing to be removed to that place. The first move towards settling the newly vacated lands after the deportation was made via proclamation by General Charles Lawrence in the Boston Gazette on the 12th of October, 1758. While Pierre and Marguerite were exiled to Walpole, this proclamation invited settlers to emigrate to their homeland. The fertile land in Nova Scotia would be a driving force in enticing the immigrants, but the New England colonists were wary. Lawrence sent a second proclamation on the 11th of January, 1759, stating that in addition to the land, Protestants would be given religious freedom and a system of government similar to that of New England. Roughly 8,000 men and women from New England eventually came to settle in the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia and in the upper St. John River Valley between 1759 and 1768. In 1759, the Robichaux family was still in Walpole. The overseers of the poor there wrote, Peter Robichaux, of 33 years of age, his wife, 30 years of age, his son Peter, of 5 years, and son Joseph, of 1 year and a half. We have found some provisions for the Robichaux family in the month of March, and some in April. Since about the middle of last April, Robichaux hath supported himself and family, but we think he can't maintain his family this winter, for his wife is very poor. He has 2 small children now, and his wife is almost ready to have the third, and they are very poorly of it for clothes.
Later, in 1759, we see how difficult that winter was for the Robichauxs. The overseers of the poor wrote, Overseers of the poor in Walpole, for what we let the new French neutrals have from the 25th of last November to the 6th of March. We found provisions for the Doutremont family all the time. We were obliged to find a great part of the Robichaux's provision, for he has been under very low circumstances almost all winter. His wife was brought to bed about the 10th or 12th of December, and she was sick till March, and she was so bad a great part of the time that many people thought she would not live, and we got 2 doctors to her. But after she got so well as to get out of doors, she had no shoes to put on her feet, and Robichaux said he had nothing to get her a pair withal, and we gave her a pair. And in cold weather in the winter, Robichaux went about with one poor thin jacket, and he said he had no other clothes to keep him warm, and we thought he suffered for want of clothes, and we let him have some cloth and buttons and mohair to make him a jacket. Please do not let the irony of this official entry escape your attentions. Here we see public record of the generous gift of shoes, some cloth and buttons by the colony of Massachusetts, the very same people who took their farms and gave them away for the sake of their own security.
And yet it truly was for the sake of their security. The English government could not be confident of the loyalty of the French and would have forever been looking over their shoulders to the north during their struggles to the west with the French and Indian Wars. The threat was not merely imagined. The last record of the overseers in Walpole concerning the Robichauxs reported that Pierre Robichaux left Walpole in debt as he moved to Wrentham. These may serve, this is what they wrote, these may serve to let your honors know that one Mr. John Cleveland of our town tells us that he let Pierre Robichaux have 1 quarter of beef last November and trusted him for it. But Robichaux has gone to live at Wrentham, and he can't get no more of him. And he comes to us to pay the bill for the beef. And we believe this is Mr. Cleveland's just due. This document from 1760, enumerating the French neutrals in the towns of Massachusetts, is the last place where we find the Robichaux family together. At this time, we lose the documented trail of Pierre and Marguerite Robichaux. At some point between 1760 and 1775, it appears that Pierre and Marguerite left Wrentham. In 1764, the Acadians were officially given permission to resettle Nova Scotia. The war was over, and France had given up its lands in North America. The Acadians were no longer considered a threat to the security of the British colony. It is unlikely that the Massachusetts government would provide anything for them, since they were no longer constrained in movement.
We never hear the details of the birth of Pierre and Marguerite's third child. We never find out if it was a girl or a boy. We never find out if the baby lived or died. The only thing we can find in public record is that, although Pierre and Marguerite left Wrentham, Pierre Jr. and Joseph remained in Wrentham. In the year 1763, Pierre, the younger, who I will now refer to as Peter, was 10 years old. His brother Joseph was 6. Now, public records are one thing, but there is something to be said about a good pick-think, and Jedediah Kingsbury had a knack for knowing and sharing everybody's business. I heard that she was at the warehouse the day that Marguerite and Pierre left those 2 boys. She said the youngest clung to his mother's skirt so that he tore the fabric in an attempt to keep his mother from leaving him behind. The poor creature cried endlessly, so that Mistress Ware said that if she had the means to return him to his mother, she would. But no one ever knew where she got to. There was no explaining to those wretched souls that try as he might, their father would never be able to recover the means to keep them fed and clothed. I heard that they were indentured to the Ware family. Peter was sent to work in the blacksmith shop with Elias, and little Joseph was kept about the property to keep up the barns and household maintenance, which was timely because they had recently lost a manservant to the influenza, just after Christmas. And bless their hearts for taking them in. Those boys barely spoke English and needed to be taught all their prayers rightly. I'm sure it was a good couple of years before they were of any real good use to them. It is said that their miserable parents attempted to regain their land in Nova Scotia and tried to rebuild what was stolen from them so that they could later send for their boys when their terms of service were up. But no one ever heard from them again. Who knows what happened? Could have been Indians. Maybe they came to an unfortunate accident when they reached Nova Scotia, so no one would have to see the faces of those whose lives they surely did wreck in seizing of the land. Whatever the case of the parents, Peter and Joseph acclimated to life in Wrentham soon enough.
Like all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60, Joseph and Peter were in Wrentham's militia. They were required to keep a serviceable firelock and serve in a part-time citizens' army. Their duty was to defend the colony and the town against enemies such as the Indians and the French. Joseph's older brother Peter volunteered to be a Minuteman and served in Oliver Pond's company of Minutemen. Minutemen were different from the basic militia in the following ways. First, while service in the militia was required by law, Minutemen were volunteers. Second, the Minutemen trained far more frequently than the militia. 2 or 3 times per week was common. Because of this serious commitment of time, they were paid. 1 shilling per drill was average. Minutemen were expected to keep their arms and equipment with them at all times, and in the event of alarm, be ready to march at a minute's warning. Militia only trained once every few months, and were only paid if they were called out beyond their town. Peter actually marched on that fate-filled day in April of 1775, when the War of Independence began. Later, in 1777 and 1778, Peter served in Robinson's regiment and then in the 4th or Suffolk, Massachusetts regiment, which fought in the Battle of Rhode Island on August 29, 1778.
It seems almost hard to understand how they had become citizen soldiers of Wrentham. They went from 2 young boys ripped from their homes to live in this foreign land, to fine young men who defended this land, truly a testament to the flexible virtues of youth. By 1779, Joseph was the head of his own household. In June of 1779, he married none other than Mary Ware. The Ware family in Wrentham has always been a family of some means, and it's surprising that Mary would have married a man from a family who was destitute when he was a child, and possibly a servant in her own home. They had a son and 2 daughters of their own, Alvin, Patty, and Polly. Their families still reside in this area. Joseph was a citizen of Wrentham throughout his several historic events. He lived there on the 2nd of March, 1778, when it was set off a separate precinct. He was also not far when Rochambeau's army camped in Wrentham in 1782, on its way back to France after defeating Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown, nephew of the same Edward Cornwallis that was instrumental in removing them from their homeland.
Joseph was part of a company of men known as Moses Knapp and Associates. This group of men bought land in Orrington in 1785, 3 years before it was incorporated a town in 1788. Peter Robichaux wasn't part of the original purchase, but later became the owner of 100 acres in Orrington.
On the 9th of December in 1786, a small sloop named the Lucy was making its way from Penobscot to Boston. The Lucy was probably a packet ship, acting as a waterbound delivery service. The ship's manifest listed 14 passengers and crew. Among them were Joseph Robichaux, Theodore Kingsbury, and the 2 Cowell brothers, all from Wrentham. The winds were not with them, and the seas got unruly as a blizzard blew into Boston Harbor. The passengers scrambled as the ship foundered. All 14 managed to make it to shore on Lovell's Island, including Joseph. Without shelter or warmth, and in the midst of the blizzard, 12 were found frozen to death. Theodore Kingsbury made it through the night and was brought home to Wrentham, but died 11 days later after dictating his last will and testament. Miss Sylvia Knapp of Mansfield and her intended did not survive winter's wicked hand. They were said to have been found perched in an icy embrace on a large rock, having frozen to death in each other's arms. To this day, that rock is known as Lover's Rock. Joseph's body was also recovered from the island.
In the City Mills Cemetery on Green Street in Franklin, you will find Theodore Kingsbury's headstone. His epitaph reads, "Saved from the ocean and tempestuous skies, reduced dust here youth and vigor lies. Dire scenes I saw on Boston's boisterous shore, distressing scenes of which a part I bore. Learn hence, ye gay, that life's a transient flower, that grows, that blooms, and withers in an hour." The details of the wreck are well known from the funeral elegy given for Captain Askins. The elegy was written for Captain Askins, but also sought to inspire people to give monies for the relief of Robert Wiley, the only survivor who lost his feet as a result of the wreck. Joseph was survived by his wife, his son, his 2 daughters, and his brother. While it is clear how Joseph died, there are some facts from late 1786 and 1787 that would lead the curious to wonder.
If you visit the Robichaux Memorial behind the Meeting House in Wrentham, Massachusetts, you will notice 2 things. First, the date of the shipwreck is listed incorrectly as December 10th, 1787. This is 1 year later than the shipwreck is recorded in the Abbott Young newspaper in Boston, 1786, and in John Askins' funeral elegy. Why is that? The probate records related to Joseph's death, including the seizure and auction of his property in Orrington, all predate the date carved into this stone. The incorrect date is carved in stone from a family of great wealth. This is probably the largest and most interesting monument in the graveyard. Is it possible that they have their facts wrong, so that they do not correspond to the records of the shipwreck? Or is this date of the wreck purposely misrepresented for another reason? Second, the birth date of Joseph's daughter is listed as November 20th, 1787. How can that be if he died in December 1786? Think about that for a moment. Finally, there is a lamb on top of the monument. This is unique among the graves. It typically indicates the death of a young child, but we do not have any records of such a death in the family. Does this lamb symbolize the way in which the Robichaux family were led away like sheep from their homeland? Or does the lamb refer back to his Catholic beginnings? I choose to believe the latter. I see the lamb representing not only the sacrificial offering and the blessings that flow forth from it, but their hope for resurrection on the last day.
And that is the end of our story. If you have any questions, we would be happy to discuss this at length.
I'm going to suggest that people unmute themselves if you have questions, so we don't have everybody unmuted at the same time. Marjorie?
Yeah, thank you for doing this. I'm wondering where did you help me with the background for how you decided to do all this research?
It started with a stroll in a graveyard, to be honest. It was just an interesting looking grave. And, you know, Steve, I clearly by the presentation, I'm more interested in flavor. He's more interested in content. But it just sort of began there and grew.
You're more interested in what, did you say?
Flavor.
Flavor, okay.
And so the facts, you know, give you an outline of what could have actually happened. We know the things that did happen, but then why did things happen? So for example, we know that Joseph and Pierre stayed behind and they were young. So how could that be? We assumed that they were probably indentured, but being indentured was very common for the French neutrals. In fact, if they were sent to New York, they were automatically separated from their parents, and the children were indentured automatically. It was just a matter of course. Here in Massachusetts, they tried seemingly to keep the families together if the parents could support the children, but I think in a lot of cases children were separated because the parents could not support the children, and the children would have been indentured. You know, it's but in the fact that they stayed behind and ended up, you know, establishing a life here was one of the most interesting facts. That they were Revolutionary War soldiers, businessmen, and married into a reasonably wealthy family. The Ware family were Smiths, and had a sizable portion of the land in Rentham at that time.
So Steve, there is a chat question which kind of pertains to what you were just talking about. It says, do we know where in Rentham they lived? Could this have been in today's Norfolk, because the names Ware and Cleveland are family names in Norfolk today?
Well, actually, they lived all over the place. Initially, when they arrived, it's believed that they were in what is now Franklin. We think that the overseers of the poor placed them in a house, and this is all hearsay. This is oral history that has come to me through various descendants of French neutrals. That in fact they lived near Daniel Street in Franklin.
We also heard from someone else that they supposed that they had lived with a group called the Clockmakers. They were sort of lived on the outskirts of town. Were they Puritan? I don't recall.
Yeah, they were like Quakers.
They were different from the rest of the town, but we heard that they were taken in by them as well. So we really don't know. We just try to piece together a story from the fact that we do have.
But that family appears all over the vital records, and I found a lot in the probate records from that time. Mary Ware, and actually, you know, the Robichaux family at that time had a sizable chunk of money. Where that came from, I cannot say, but there was a lot of probate issues to be worked through. Like he was indebted when he passed away, so his brother was sent to Orrington to dispose of the property. Now I know later on, because I read Pierre's will, that by I think it was 1808 is when Pierre died. He had 100 acres when he died that he was disposing of, and leaving it actually to his brother's kids, his nieces and nephews. He left the property to them.
There's another chat question or comment. My mom's maiden name is from Karen Leahy. My mom's maiden name is Robichaux from Nova Scotia. They changed the spelling to Robishaw. They lived in Maine. Curious if they're related.
S-H-A-W?
S-H-A-W. Yeah.
Yes, surely they are. It was Robichaux with the X. Robichaud with a D
D,
is apparently a different family. But Robichaux, S-H-A-W, was a misspelling with the English-speaking Protestant colonists here were mishearing a lot of things. So the Amerault family, they were spelled, that lived in Bellingham, they were spelled O-M-E-R-O, Omero, Amerault. And the Robichauxs were Robichauxs, R-O-B-E, and actually even into the Revolutionary War, his muster records show Robichaux.
This has Robichaux, R-O-B-I-S-H-A-W, and the maiden name was Robichaux, C-H-A-U-D.
Robichaux, as far as I know, with the D, that was a different family.
Okay.
Okay.
Marjorie?
You talked about Orrington, and I don't have any idea where Orrington would be.
At the time, Orrington was part of Massachusetts, but now it's part of Maine. And if you were to travel south from Bangor along the Penobscot River, about 7 or 8 miles, you would be in Orrington. And actually, that packet ship was very likely, the one he shipwrecked in, was probably coming down. We know for a fact that the Lucy made trips between Penobscot Bay and Boston Harbor. So it's pretty easy to imagine that it went further up the Penobscot Bay and up into the river into Orrington.
There were other families from Wrentham that also owned property in Orrington. We assume that it was sort of a joint venture.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Marjorie, can you talk a little bit about the Overseers of the Poor stuff that we found when we wrote for the book? Just give a little short summary of that, because it kind of reflects a little bit on this.
Oh, I was very interested when you were talking about looking through the records of the Overseers of the Poor. At least in Bellingham and Wrentham, where I did research for our community history for Bellingham now and then, there are records going back when you were describing into the 1700s. The poor farms didn't start until the turn of the 19th century into early 1800s. But there were, prior to that, there were this overseers of the poor were responsible. Every community had overseers for the poor that were responsible for taking care of families that weren't able to support themselves. And that typically it sounds like they were sent out to various families to provide clothes and shoes and a place to live, a room of some sort, and food, clothes, and I think some school, but I'm not really sure, educational books, but maybe not. I can't remember, but every town, that was so I was smiling when you were talking about the different towns saying, you owe because of this. And there was a lot of squabbling that went on back and forth between who was responsible for this poor family and who had to pay the bill for this poor family. It never stopped. It never stopped.
We saw that the French neutral families were pushed around from one town to the next. And
I'm not surprised.
yeah, a lot of times it was the Overseers of the Poor who were complaining, and I found lots of letters written to the governor or to the representatives saying, we shouldn't be responsible for these people. We've had them for years. Pass them on to somebody else now.
That was exactly any town that had, you basically were responsible for the people in your own town, and you got to send a bill. If there was somebody from another town, they would get to send the bill for those people to pay for the care for the people that were in your own town. So if you had people that were townless, as all of these people were, you were really stuck.
Interestingly, I found a pair of letters, hopefully. One letter was from a man who was in debtor's prison in Pembroke, and he had petitioned the governor saying, I'm here in a debtor's prison. I couldn't pay for something, beef or something like that. And I've been here for months now, and during this harsh season, he wrote it in the wintertime, I'm fearful that my wife and my children are provided for. You know, can you please, you know, see if they are okay? And I didn't see any response to him. Maybe the town, Pembroke, might have his response. But what I did find was another letter from the governor. The governor, when he wrote letters, they wrote them in pairs, and they put one in the archive and one went to the town. The letter that the governor sent, Pownell at the time, I think, he wrote a letter to Pembroke saying, how is it that French neutrals that were placed in your care find themselves in a debtor's prison? So I thought that was interesting. It was an angry letter, to say the least. So I hopefully that man, you know, and his family survived that winter, and things were rectified.
It was rife for abuse. Any of these situations have been all along. There are no good solutions for it, and nobody wants to feel like they're stuck taking care of somebody else. But especially, you were describing the father being 59 and a fisherman by trade. He was certainly not adapted to come and live inland on farms that weren't necessarily what he knew how to grow things.
He was originally from Sable.
Yeah, Cape Sable.
Cape Sable, which was, we were a little bit confused because Sable Island is a teeny tiny island, and wondering maybe if he actually lived on the island and did nothing but fish. But Cape Sable is still pretty much nothing but water as well. So he would have been literally a fish out of water.
Yeah.
I did anticipate one question. When I've spoken about the French neutrals before, people have asked me if there are any good books. So I am part of the way through this one. This one is a Great and Noble Scheme by John Farrager. So that is, I can recommend it so far, unless it gets terrible more than halfway through.
No, the Acadians that have really maintained identity are all ended up in Louisiana. So,
Yes.
But that was all still part of that deportation, correct?
Yes, it was. So they were deported throughout the colonies, right? Each colony taking about 1,000, being that there was about 12,000 of them in 13 colonies. So some got more or less than 1,000, but they did spread them pretty evenly over the colonies. What we found was some colonies, like Georgia, wouldn't take them, and the ones that could flee ended up some in the Caribbean. And after the war, the French and Indian War was over, many ended up in Louisiana. The vast majority that never made it back to the maritime provinces ended up in Louisiana, and of course are now known to us as Cajuns, which is probably, you know, the word Acadian, you know, over 250 years decayed with a Southern accent. Yeah, so their culture to some degree does live on. In fact, the governor of Louisiana today is Catholic.
Do we have any more questions?
I'm wondering if it would be possible for you to, do you have a transcript of this? It was difficult to just follow it over orally, listening to everything. You really shared an awful lot. Is it possible for me to get a transcript just so I can be a little more accurate in describing your program for the bulletin, the Bellingham Bulletin?
Yeah, I can convert the presentation to a PDF file and email it to me.
That would be terrific.
Steve, I'll get you Marjorie's email.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, I think,
Another question there.
Yep. Is your background photo from Annapolis Gardens?
This is the Peak House in Medfield. We actually, we videoed this live, just kind of stood by and thought it would make a nice backdrop for us while we spoke. Flavor.
Very nice.
But it is typical of New England homes in the 18th century, so we thought it would be appropriate.
It's tiny.
As many were. In fact, there was a French neutrals family that lived in Medfield, several. and they stayed in a house very similar to this one. It was, but smaller yet. And interestingly, one of the families were descendants of the House of Savoy. They were royalty, so they were not expected to do manual labor.
This Peak House is in Medfield now. It's pretty close to the road. It's been moved. Actually, I believe it was burnt down during the King Philip's War, but this is a rebuild of it. And it's right on 109. You can kind of pull over and peek in the windows. Off to the right there is an authentic perennial garden, and they separate medicinal and culinary herbs. There's been a lot of love put into this Peak House. That's why we thought it'd be a great backdrop.
So there's a comment that says it looks similar to the French house reconstruction in Annapolis Royal Gardens in Nova Scotia.
It does. It does. We have yet to make our way up there, but that would have made a great background. I had considered a meadow in Grand Prix, but it would have been a little bit more difficult to convey the 18th century with no structures.
Okay, are we all set?
And this was a joint program between the Bellingham Library and the Historical Society?
So basically it's Steve's presentation. Steve is on the Historical Commission. The library is the partner because it's our Zoom account and our we did the registration and we're the infrastructure. He's the content.
Okay. Okay. So, right.
Yeah, Bernadette, the library, did all the legwork and the technical stuff.
I just have one question for Steve on that. You said the Emerald family, or it was in Bellingham.
Yes.
Is there anything that lists where they lived in Bellingham?
Sadly, no. No, there's not even any mention of them in Bellingham's vital records.
Wow.
The only thing that I could find was in the state archives. And actually, as Marjorie was mentioning, the Overseers of the Poor's letters asking for money for, they were petitioning for money for the expenses incurred by the Emeralds is the only way that I would know that they were here.
Oh.
Well, I want to thank you. I think you did it was a wonderful presentation, lots of information, and thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you soon with some more programming from the Historical Commission.
Great. Thank you
Our
so
pleasure.
much.
Take care. Good night.
That was great. Thank you.
All right.